Introduction to servlets. What we're going to start to do now is talk about server-side web programming utilizing Java, specifically one technology of importance called servlets. And if you don't know what a servlet is, we're going to go over that in the overview. Once we kind of understand what a servlet is, then we're going to start working in fundamental servlet programming. There's a couple of things I want to go over as far as setting up your development environment, how to create some servlets, and then deploy them specifically to Tomcat. Then we're going to write a couple of servlets that intercept information from an HTML page's form, and then does some processing, and then send some data back to the form. So what exactly is a servlet? Well, that's a really good question. A servlet is a compiled Java application. So they're Java applications, but they're special kind of applications. And the first thing I need you to understand is they're compiled Java applications. The second thing is that they're special, and one of the things or one of the characteristics that makes a servlet special is it has to run in something called a servlet container. Well, what is a servlet container? Well, a servlet container is essentially a web server or a servlet server or an application server that goes by a couple of different names. But the bottom line is a servlet container knows how to execute servlets, and servlets live on the web server. So here you see HTTPD. The D stands for daemon, which means it's a service. And another cool characteristics and a benefit of writing a servlet is that they're web browser independent, not dependent, but independent. What does that mean? Well, that simply means that you could go ahead and use Internet Explorer and Netscape and do all of the programming on the server, meaning on the servlet. And that way you avoid some of the complex issues and really some of the nastiness that comes about when developing client-side web applications, because there are some issues of, what version of Netscape or Internet Explorer is the user using? Do they have cookies turned on? Do they not have cookies? Am I going to be able to do all the cool stuff I need to do? Well, if you just kind of blow that off and use a servlet, then you have all the control here. And servlets run interference or pass interference between technologies like databases or email servers or XML web services with SOAP or whatever. So the idea is the client is over here, and who cares what they're using? Internet Explorer, Netscape, we don't care. They make a request to the servlet. The servlet then does some cool things like hook up to JDBC or an email server or whatever, and then it streams back to the client nice HTML. So what you can generate is dynamic HTML. And why would you want to generate dynamically HTML? Well, you might want to generate web pages that are maybe based on some information that the client sends to the servlet, like a web page that does searches, internet searches, database queries, the results of which are different every time. That has to be generated on the fly every single time. That's dynamically generated HTML. Or changes, or web pages rather, that change quite often. Maybe you're putting up a web page that, does something like news, a news service, like a news website, or corporate information that changes constantly. Well, you don't want to create that statically. That's HTML that's generated on the fly. And that's another example of dynamic HTML. So whenever you need HTML generated on the fly dynamically, a great fit to meet that need and a good technology to solve that would be to use a Java servlet. Now before we dig in and start writing some servlets, there's a little bit of background that you have to understand. Let me hop out to the Java website. So I'm going to go to http java.sun.com. And what you'll notice is it says Java technologies organized into subject areas. And one of them is the Enterprise Server, or J2EE, Enterprise Edition of Java. Now, so far, we've been really almost exclusively on the J2 SE, Standard Edition. But now we're going to start talking about the JDK Java 2 EE, Enterprise Edition. And one of the things that that defines is ways for creating servlets. Now, it's a lot of people think you have to go ahead and download it. Let me go to the download page, and here we have the J2EE 1.4 SDK. So if we go to that download page, you'll see that there's various ways of downloading it, and they give you a nice graphical representation of some of the things that's involved. Here's the J2EE 1.4, and they do it now and they bundle it with various other applications, and they call them software bundles. And you can choose to download a bundle, or you can go ahead and download things uniquely. Of course, we have versions for Windows XP and Windows 2000. Okay. Now, here's one of the first bundles that you can download, and this is basically the all-in-one. It's the J2EE 1.4 SDK. It's between 100 and 10 megs, 113 megs or so. It gives you the Java Sun Java System Application Server, and this would basically be the web server slash servlet container that you could run your servlets in. You download the J2 SE, that's a part of it, the standard edition, and then you have your J2EE, and then you can go ahead and download the various components individually. You could also come down here and grab the Java 2 EE 1.4 SDK and the Sun System Server application, and this is an update. Now, we have already downloaded and installed Tomcat, so we don't need to do this because we basically have our servlet container defined. So that replaces the Sun Java System Application Server. We don't need that because we're using Tomcat. We also have the J2 Standard Edition installed. So the question is, do we in fact need the J2EE? Well, let's hop out to the Tomcat installation directory. So if I go to my computer and we explore and we go look at to see where we put Tomcat. So let's go to local disk here, C, and then go into the Tomcat directory. So Jakarta Tomcat. And then what we want to do is we want to find where, well, what I want to show you is this. So let's go ahead and go into the following directory. We're going to go into common. So now I'm at C, Jakarta, Tomcat 5554 common, and then go into the lib directory. Let's change this to a details view. Here is something that's important. Here we get a servlet-apr.jar file. This is a subcomponent and a Tomcat component for developing servlets to Tomcat. Now, Tomcat is 100% compliant with the server, or rather the servlet standard. So a servlet that we develop for Tomcat will pretty much work anywhere. Hence one of the reasons why we're using Tomcat as our servlet container. Here you can see here's the JSP, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So one of the first things you have to do for housekeeping is you have to set a path statement that points to the servlet-apr.jar file. So if I right click on my computer and I go to properties and we bring up the advanced properties of the computer icon, so we go to my computer and we go to advanced environmental variables. If you take a look at my class path, I have a statement in there pointing to the servlet-apr.jar file. If you notice here, I also have a little semicolon, which means look in the current directory. So, or rather a period, which means look in the current directory. So I have period, semicolon, because it's semicolon delimited, and then a path all the way to the servlet-apr.jar file. And I'll show you what that allows me to do here in just a few seconds. Now what I want to do is just kind of hop back into the Java website. Let's go ahead and go scroll up to the top here. And over on the sides, I'm going to go to the API specification. And that API specification is going to basically give us the API that we're very used to looking at, but notice the URL here. Instead of going to the J2 SE, it is going to the Java 2 Enterprise Edition. So I'm going to go ahead and go into favorites, add a favorite, and I'm going to store that link. So we have a favorite mark to the java.sun.com/J2 Enterprise Edition 1.4 docs. If we take a look at the packages listed up on the top, notice they all start with JavaX. Here you'll see things like EJB. This is Enterprise Java Beans. You'll see this is where there's a lot of enterprise packages, so you'll see things aptly named with enterprise in there. Here's javax.mail for interfacing with SMTP, javax.management, resource, and then we come down to javax.servlet, javax.servlet.http, etc. And here we'll see some JSP in there as well. Okay, so this is important, especially javax.servlet and javax.servlet.http. And by setting a path into that to that servlet-api.jar, I basically have the ability to open up Notepad. So let's open up Notepad and let's create just a kind of basic file here. So I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to put this in my servlet directory, servlets, and I'll call this demo1.java. I better do this in quotes here. Demo1.java. Notice it's a simple .java file. And watch this. Import javax.servlet. Okay? And let's go ahead and say public class demo1. And for right now, I don't want to do too much in there just yet because this is the first test. So I saved that. Let's go into a command prompt and clear that. Let's go into the cd java servlets directory. Now if I do a java c star.java, it's going to compile. And the reason why I don't get an error is because I set my class path to point to that servlet-api.jar file. It knows now where to look up any kind of information about the javax.servlet namespace. So that's why we go ahead and set that class path. So that's a very critical step right there. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to set up a basic structure of a servlet that handles GET requests. Okay, and there's POST and GET requests, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few more minutes. But this is essentially going to be the fundamental servlet template. So let me mark this down here. So I'm going to do a multi-line comment here. So do that and kind of do a copy, paste, 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 and then a close that. And I'm going to label this as such as how about a get request servlet template. Okay, and here's what I mean. We're going to need to import java.io. Java.io is important because servlets throw an exception, an IO exception, as we'll see here in a little bit. Then we're going to need to import javax.servlet, and we're going to import javax.servlet.http because we are going to write a servlet that is the more popular kind, and what that does is that inherits from the HTTP servlet class. And now we just go ahead and write a class. So public class demo1, which is really the servlet, extends HTTP servlet. Okay, so the first thing is you have to at least import these three packages minimally: java.io, javax.servlet, javax.servlet.http. Then you have to write your own class. Of course, you can call it whatever you want, and it has to extend HTTP servlet. Now, because we're doing a GET request, let me show you what we're going to do. We're going to hop out to the online documentation and go to servlet.http, and we're going to go ahead and take a look at a very important method here that's part of the HTTP servlet. And here that we can see HTTP servlet extends generic servlet, and it gives us some information about their public abstract class HTTP servlet. It's abstract, so we can extend it. It itself extends generic servlet. It implements serializable. Okay, so remember, implements means it utilizes an interface. Now, the serializable interface means simply that we're tagging this as something that can be serialized. And this servlet is going to be serialized. In other words, it's going to be converted into a stream of bits. Okay. Now, the cool thing about the HTTP servlet over just generic servlet is it gives us some more control over the servlet, like a do get if it supports HTTP gets. And that's what we're doing, or a do post for HTTP posts. So let's come down here and look at the do get method. And I'm going to go ahead and click on the do get method, and it takes two arguments, a servlet request and a servlet response, and it throws two servlets, and one of which is IO exception. And you'll notice that anytime you have things that are serializable, they typically throw IO exception. So here I'm going to say public void do get, and it takes HTTP servlet request, I'll call that REQ, and HTTP servlet response, I'll call it res. Okay, those are the arguments, and it throws two important exceptions, servlet exception, and IO exception. Okay, now I can go ahead and define my action here. And typically what you'll do is you'll maybe take in some requests. This is a do get, so you'll usually take in some information in there. You'll formulate a response, and typically what you will do is you'll generate a print writer, which you're going to use to stream data out. And that's basically going to be built from the response dot get writer class. Okay, and then you can go ahead and start streaming information back out or send it back out to the client. So let me go ahead and save this. And let's jump in here and compile it just to make sure we're on the right track. Let's go into the Java servlets directory, Java C star.java, and see how we do. Oh, looks like I have one little typo here. It's not printer writer, but it's print writer. It's kind of moving a little too quick, so let's go ahead and save that. But I'm pretty excited about those results because I'm not getting any kind of errors about cannot locate a symbol, which means that my class path is working. And here we go. So you remember, when you compile in Java, no news is good news, right? So let's kind of revisit with what I did here because this is the essential template. You go ahead and you have to import these three packages. Have to. Java.io, because you're utilizing or extending a class that implements the serializable java.io.serializable interface, and it also throws IO exception. JavaX.servlet and JavaX.servlet.http. HTTP servlet class is found in the JavaX.servlet.http package. I give the class a name. In this example, I'm choosing to do a do get, so I'll go ahead and initiate that. And then I simply go ahead and write some data out. So let's go ahead and build and compile our own servlet. And let's go ahead and have configure Tomcat to go ahead and generate the output and register with Tomcat our servlet. Now that we understand the basic servlet template, let's go ahead and take a look at the steps involved in writing and deploying a servlet. So what's the first step? Well, the first step is essentially writing a servlet, which I've already done. Notice I did everything that I'm supposed to do in the template. Here I'm importing the three minimal necessary packages, java.io, javax.servlet, javax.servlet.http. I've written my own class that extends from HTTP servlet. Here I'm using public void do get, and I'm passing in the appropriate parameters, HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response. Really quick note on these two objects or these two classes. Think of HTTP servlet request as input into the servlet. So anytime you have information coming into the servlet, you will use the HTTP request object. Anytime you're specifying output back to the client, you're going to use the HTTP servlet response. And essentially you have a request input response output relationship. So of course I'm throwing the right exceptions. So it should be now that I've said that response deals with output, it shouldn't be a surprise that the response, HTTP servlet response object, somehow has the ability to give me a print writer to print out to the stream. And it does. Get writer allows me to do that. So I could create a print writer, pwout, and I can simply write, hi everybody. Okay, so we go ahead and compile that, and it compiles. And of course, it compiles into a class. So let's take a look at my c:/java/servlets directory here. And you can see I have the hi everybody class. Then what you do is you go ahead and you deploy that into your web application. The web application we set up earlier is in the Jakarta, let me just back up here, web apps, and I put it into my rbtest1 directory. So in there, we talked a little bit about this earlier, is that all-important directory structure. We have the web.inf directory, or web-inf. Let's go ahead and kind of view this a little bit more nicely. There we go. And there's the web-inf, and then the classes. And we copy and drag and drop our classes into this web-inf directory. Okay? The next thing we have to do is configure Tomcat to know that, hey, you've got a servlet in there by such a name. So we've deployed our class into here. Then we're going to come into the root of the web-inf directory, and we're going to edit the web.xml file. So let me open that up in Notepad. And what we do is we specify two elements within the web-app element, the servlet and the servlet mapping. In the servlet, we go ahead and specify a name. Like here is the servlet that is configuring the hi everybody. So I point out the name of the servlet and the class file of the servlet. It happens to be a one-to-one relationship. In other words, that class file, hieverybody.class, has this. Remember, class files can have multiple classes in there, and you'll have one class file, or one.java file can have multiple classes. So usually you'll have a one-to-one relationship here. Now, I can name the servlet whatever I want. It gives me some flexibility here. For example, here I've got a test servlet class file. As you can see in the classes directory, test servlet, but I named it my test. So, like I say, it gives me some flexibility. I happen to name it the same here, the name of the class file as well as the name of the servlet. Now, if I don't specify the servlet mapping, I have to access it calling and invoking the servlet container by specifying servlet in the URL. But I don't want to do that. What I want to do is I want to give it my own URL by specifying a pattern. In this case, I am going to specify the hi everybody servlet corresponding to the hi everybody name up here with the following pattern, /hi. Let me just show you how that plays out. If I go into my local host /rbtest, and should have it, there we go, and I go hi, you can see what it's going to do is it's going to simply call my servlet with the /hi URL. So that's really cool and gives me a lot of flexibility. Now you'll notice I already have Tomcat running. Well, every time you deploy a new servlet, you have to stop and restart Tomcat. And that can really stink. So what Tomcat gives you is a really cool web management tool. And you can find that at the root. So if I go to localhost and bring up the default Tomcat application, just by going to localhost, I have Tomcat Manager, and I sign into it. So let's go ahead and sign into that. Now this Tomcat Manager is installed by default. One of the things it allows me to do is reload a web application without having to stop and restart Tomcat. So I can deploy new servlets in there all the time without rebooting my server, so to say. Here you can see that I reloaded into RBTest1. Now something that's really important for you to know about that manager is that it's installed by default, but the security is not turned on by default. So you have to go ahead and turn that on. And it's relatively simple to turn it on. You go into the conf directory in the Tomcat, and you'll see a tomcat-users XML file. And you may be starting to draw an opinion on, hey, everything in Tomcat is configured with these XML files, and you would be correct. And what you do is you create yourself a new user, and you give it a username of whatever you want. I did it Robert. Notice it is case sensitive. In other words, if I signed in with a lowercase r, that would not work. It has to be uppercase. And I give it a password, so I specified a password, and then I define the roles. And there's one role you have to be in order to access that website, and that's the manager role. I went ahead and I just put myself in all the following roles. Role 1, Tomcat, Manager, and Admin. But by specifying this in the tomcat-users.xml file, I now have the ability to go ahead and access that manager site. It's important to realize that Tomcat no longer ships with a default security configuration. I think they wised up to the fact that very few people change the defaults. Now they just ship with absolutely everything turned off, and you have to go ahead and create that user. The last thing we're going to take a look at is how forms and servlets can interact with each other. What I did over here is I created a simple HTML form. Nothing too magic going on here. I went ahead and I specified the title of the HTML page called Form Demo. And here I specified the body tag, and inside of it I've got the form tag, or the form element. I gave the form a name, and I specified a method of get. And just so you know, that is the default method. There's really two methods, get and post. The big difference that you'll notice right off the bat if you specify a method of get or post is the method of get specifies the information you're passing to the next page in the URL address bar. And we'll go ahead and show that to you. A post does not. So post tends to be more secure because it doesn't pass that information. However, get is a lot more fast and you get a better performance increase. So I'm going to go ahead and do a get. Now the action is who's going to receive the value or the data sent by the HTTP GET method that we're sending. And here I'm sending it to the following servlet address. Notice it's just /processform. And I'll show you again where I specify that in the web.xml. Here I create 3 HTML elements and I specify input types. Notice the names, txt first name for the first name, txt ln rather, and fn and ln for the first and the last name respectively, and txt eml for the email address. That's essentially the HTML form behind it. Let's come over here and take a look at the servlet. The servlet is just, again, it's our template. Here I've got the first 3 lines are the necessary packages to import. Then I create a class called processForm, which extends HTTP servlet. I go ahead and write my doGet method, passing in the appropriate parameters and throwing the appropriate exceptions. And then the first thing I do, because I'm going to generate HTML output, is I use the response, which is output back to the client, response, and I use the setContentType method, and I specify text HTML. And that tells the browser that, hey, HTML is coming. Here I'm going to start configuring HTML, but check this out. I specify a string HTML, and I start the string as HTML, and then I just append a head with a title, the body, and then look at this. Your name, bold, plus request.getParameter. Remember, the HTTP request deals with input into the servlet. There's a get parameter that allows me to extract information. And that parameter like will associate to the various parameters or input elements that you specify. So I have txtfn, txtln, and txteml as designated by the name attribute that I assign the value to the name attribute. So notice how I say your name is request.getParameter txt first name plus txt last name, and I'm just making it bold. And then I'm saying your email address is getParameter txt etc. Okay, so that's the Java that goes into that. I compile my Java class file and I pop it into the webinf classes directory. Here you can see process form. Let's take a look at the web.xml. Open that up. I go ahead and I give the servlet name, okay, servlet name, process form, servlet class, process form. Again, it just happens to be that I chose to keep this the same. And then here I specify my servlet mapping. The process form is going to be mapped to /process form. Once I get it into the classes, I don't have to quit and restart Tomcat. Again, what I can do is I could utilize the manager that comes with Tomcat. And what that lets me do is go ahead and reload an application without having to restart the server as a whole. And remember, I configured the Tomcat users XML file to do this. So I come to my rbtest1 and I reload it. Yes, I'm absolutely sure. And here it can say reload application successful. It says OK, which is good. Then what I'll do is I'll go to my /rbtest1 /form.html, okay, the simple test form. Let that come on up. I'll put in my name, Robert Barr, email address of robert at cbtnuggets.com. Send that over to the servlet. Notice how it says question mark txtfn equals Robert and txtln. This is because I'm doing a HTTP GET. If I was doing the POST, I would not see any of that up there. You can see that my servlet retrieved the information and went ahead and generated this HTML on the fly. If I do a right click and do a view source, this is what's being spit back out to me, just this long stream of HTML. And that's how we can see the relationship between servlets and HTML forms. In Introduction to Servlets, went ahead and showed you the fundamentals of servlets. First gave you a nice overview as to show you what is the role of servlets. Servlets can sit in between web applications and databases, email servers, and things like that. Gave you the servlet fundamentals as far as the 3 packages that you have to import, the class you have to extend, and how to use the do-get method. There's also do-post, which works exactly the same way. And then I showed you how to create an HTML form and then connect it up to a servlet. I hope you have found this informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.